friends. Welcome to the 10 Laws with the East Forest podcast. I am said Forest of the East, Individual One. Thank you for joining us. And thank you so much for everyone who's given the podcast a review, the 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, written review, those of you who have shared it with your friends on social media and tagged us. That's always awesome. And we really appreciate it when you hit the subscribe button. So thank you and welcome to any new listeners. This week, I have a conversation with Bill Plotkin. Bill is an amazing person. He is an author and a speaker. Let's see what else it says about him. He had a pretty interesting description about himself on the website. I'll find it. But his new book is called The Journey of Soul Initiation, a field guide for Visionaries, Evolutionaries, and Revolutionaries. You might know Bill from his book, Soulcraft. And he's also he's been heading up, or the founder, I think, of the Animas Institute in Southwest Colorado, which is an amazing place. So if you head over to animas.org, ANIMAS.org, you'll see all about his book and everything they do and rites of passage stuff and all the jazz. It's a very grounded, deep dive, and it feels like the kind of medicine that we really need these days as a way of working through this transition. Bill is described as a depth psychologist, a wilderness guide, and an agent of cultural evolution. And that's a great way of putting it, cultural evolution. And it's, as I would contend, from the soul outward. So I thought we had a really meaningful conversation, and it's a really wonderful book with tons and tons of information in there. So we will get right into this. But first, I just want to thank everyone who has signed up for the East Forest Council on Patreon. We had our first 2 weeks of sort of launching it, and now we're in our first full month here in March. And we've got different kinds of things we're offering, including the Zoom Council. We did one of our councils, so that was super cool. And I offer like unreleased music sometimes, and I've got special solo casts and other podcast material that will go up there that's unreleased, amongst other things that will be included in this Patreon space. Check it out, eastforest.org. Scroll down, you can see all the information, or just go to patreon.com/eastforest. But I do want to say thank you to those who signed up since the last podcast, including Brian F., old school supporter, Joe M., Tom Katahi. Sorry. I mean, it's an interesting name. I appreciate it. Thank you for being a council cub. Samia McCall, Derek H., Vishnu, Dustin, or Dus, B., Gabriella Jones, and Juan Carlos F. I know it's strange that I'm reading some last names and some not, and I'm sitting there in my mind thinking like, oh, I shouldn't, but then I'm like, no, it's okay, but then I'm going back and forth, and that makes absolutely no sense. But our heart is filled with gratitude for everyone who has joined the council, and it's just a great experiment for us to see how we can engage deeper in a centralized space and walk this walk together and find ways to give each other tools and to connect and to track one another and witness. And so that's what we're diving into it. Check it out, patreon.com/eastforest. It's a great way also to just support this podcast, as I'm not running any other ads or anything like that, and it's not behind any kind of paywall, if you are able to support and want to support. So thank you very much for everyone who's done that. Otherwise, I don't know about you, like spring is starting to creep in, which is cool. And I'm starting to feel like some things from the old world are coming back in, like inquiries and conversations about doing live events at different places and these sorts of things. And while it's exciting, I'll be honest, there's a part of me that is scared. Like I think I haven't fully recognized what a heavy lift it is to get back into the thought of getting on a plane and flying somewhere and performing. And it's not just about the travel. I mean, that's part of it too that feels like, wow, I haven't done that in so long, and I was doing it so much. It's also, there's like a part of me that feels very tender, like Bio Akomolafe talked about on the podcast here so wonderfully about there's a becoming, there's an invitation. And in that becoming, I feel tender. Like I don't fully know what to say. It's so in process. And in some ways it feels like, you're being asked to say things or come to some form of conclusion or have a pathway through it. And I don't. And I don't know. And does anyone know? But there's this recognition of newness and that tenderness again, that there's a vulnerability to that. And I just feel it really coming up. And perhaps it's sort of a good analogy with spring, with the buds, very tender buds coming up, and they could be stepped on, but they also are just reaching for sunlight and discovering what they are into a new season, into a new year. And I feel the same way. And I'm sharing that with you to just to give voice to it, because it's a part of me that I don't want to squash down. I don't want to say, God damn it, I have the answer, or cover it up with any kind of strength. The strength is there too, but there's a valuable part of us, at least in myself, and I would guess in you too, that can be scared at times and not know. And we want to hold that too and hold it along in this path where we can say, that's okay. You have a seat at the table, and that's valid, and that's okay. But that being said, there is so many things in motion right now, and I'm working on a lot of things in the studio here. And I got my dog Kaya for a couple weeks, so I just went and picked her up in Pendleton, did a little drop-off pickup. So that's super good medicine for me, getting the doggy medicine. She's my OG dog from my original dog, my only dog. She's about 11 and a half now. So we've been on a real journey together, and she spends the other half of her time with my former partner, Karina, in Portland. And I don't get to see her as much, but I'm really grateful for when I do, because, man, do I dig a good oxytocin hit. Live for that shit. Live for it. Okay, let's do this. This is a wonderful conversation with the brilliant Bill Plotkin. Well, Bill Plotkin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I received a copy of your new book, and I've been familiar with your work for a long time. Mm-hmm. So it is an honor and really exciting to be able to cross paths and get a chance to enter into some conversation. And I first just want to say congratulations, because this book is quite an accomplishment. This is like a major piece. There's a lot of material in this.
There is.
And it's rich, very rich.
Of course, it doesn't even count all that I cut out of it, but yeah,
really?
It's really 40 years of research.
It feels like it. It's an extremely deep map, and building on the work you've already put out there. So I would love, I think a really important way to start this conversation, to kind of give people sort of like a compass in a way, is if you could just give us a little bit of an overview about what this is, this journey that you're delineating in this book, and it would give us kind of a basic map, and then I can go from there together.
That's great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So The Journey of Soul Initiation, that's the title of the book, is a process of several years for most people that results in becoming what I call a visionary artisan of cultural evolution, which is my preferred term rather than saying adult, because that word adult usually has the wrong connotations these days. And but it is an initiation into true adulthood. But it's not a kind of adulthood that's on any of our Western maps. Right. Certainly none of our mainstream Western maps. Certainly none of our Western psychology maps. And I was trained as a psychologist. So it's something that most people, quite possibly most of our listeners, would not be familiar with. It's not an initiation from childhood into adolescence, certainly not from childhood into adulthood. What I've come to understand is that there's actually two stages of adolescence. And the second stage, late adolescence, is one that most contemporary people in most societies never reach because
Mm.
of a form of arrested human development that is in most places in the world now. So it's the way our human minds work is that when someone's introducing, like me, some new ideas, or just the subject of one's book, the listener will tend to categorize it as something they already know about. And so
Mm.
I want to encourage the listeners to consider is that you might not know about what I mean by true adulthood. I believe it's a kind of adulthood that every healthy culture has some form of, but there's not many healthy cultures left in the world. Um, so, just a couple quick examples of what it isn't. This isn't a rite of passage. It isn't a hero's journey like the way Joseph Campbell spoke of it. It's not a form of therapy. It's not any kind of healing. It's actually counter-therapeutic in some ways. It's not a psychedelic journey, although those can be part of it. It's not a state of transcendence where you merge with the divine. It's not shamanism. I could go on. It's
Yeah.
probably not what you're familiar with.
It's not everything else.
Yeah.
Well, here's my question. True adulthood. I think this is such an amazing concept to consider about how so many people aren't arriving to this place and how it's so important for the evolution of humanity and what it means to be a full human being. But I guess what I want to ask is like, what is stopping people from reaching that? And why is it that we're not seeing people even having the ability to reach those stages? You talk about it, a process of going into a descent, and that how many people never even get to the point where they're even ready to get to that stage, let alone then
Yes.
go through this long journey to the evolution of your full potentiality.
Right. Well, first of all, what I mean by initiated adulthood is just very generally speaking, it's a mystical relationship with the Earth community.
Mm.
I'll be a little bit more specific. It's an initiated adult is someone who has had one or more visions or revelation of their unique niche in the more than human world, the place they were born to take in the larger Earth community. So it's founded upon a visionary experience. And an adult is someone who's not only had a vision like that, but has found a way, has cultivated a way of embodying it or manifesting it as a gift for not just their human people, but for the whole Earth community. So, so a true adult is someone who's taking their part in the larger community beyond the perimeters of the human village and is contributing in a life-enhancing way. Why don't we get there? And you're right, Krishna, that in my understanding is that most people, I will say over 80% of contemporary people, certainly 80% of Westerners, which is the people I've been working with, more than 80% never reach this second stage of adolescence, which I call the cocoon stage. And the reason they don't is because of the way they were raised as children, the way we all were raised, that there are developmental failures in both early childhood and middle childhood. And that results in an early adolescence after puberty, where we're not resourced enough to succeed at the developmental tasks of early adolescence, which briefly is to create a persona, a social presence, a way of being in the world and socially that is both authentic and socially acceptable to at least one peer group. So you have this sense of social belonging, but you're really being true to yourself, even on the ego level, which is to say, what your emotions are when you're having them. You know how to assimilate your emotions. You know what your values are. You know what your limits are. You know what your deepest interests are. You know what you live for, and so forth. And it's become difficult for contemporary people to even discover what is truly authentic for them, or to be in a good relationship with their own emotions, or to have healed any significant amount of their trauma, which we all have because of our contemporary cultures. So people get stuck in early adolescence. And even if they live to their 80s, 90s, 100s, they remain in early adolescence. And it's even worse than that. Okay, just briefly, that a large percentage of that 80% who are stuck in early adolescence are stuck in a pathological, egocentric version of it. And if we look around, socially in the world today, even in the Western world, we see a lot of craziness, and it's actually a form of pathology, a form of unhealthy early adolescence. And I'm convinced that every major crisis in the world today is due to arrested human development, which you can really see if you pay attention, for example, to the lives of politicians.
Yeah, there's a hunger there, filling some kind of hole. It does seem to be a pathology of like, especially when you're really old. You look at some really old politicians, and you're like, why is the overwhelming motivation to hold on to that perceived power or that power?
Mm-hmm.
That is the main driving force. And sometimes I look at it, just I don't understand why they would care. You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense to me sometimes.
Well, it's an example of a compensatory ambition, because we're all born with an ambition to love and to contribute and to enhance life everywhere we
Mm.
can. And that's what as humans, we're born to do. And if we can't find our path to doing that because of what I was speaking about earlier, arrested human development, then we kind of grab for compensatory ambitions. And one kind is power, another kind is wealth. There's all kinds, but that's a kind of pathology that apparently only humans are capable of. So in a healthy culture, there wouldn't be anything that corresponds to politicians. What you have in a healthy culture are called elders, true elders. True elderhood is, of course, a development beyond adulthood, but you can't get into elderhood until you've been an adult for a while. So
Yes.
elders are not elected. Elders are recognized.
And in a way, I've always seen it also as chosen in this idea that we, as individuals, we have to choose in some ways what we recognize to be an elder too in our own lives. And I want to ask you what level choice plays in our ability to enter into this process or this descent. I mean, let's say there's a listener out there who's thinking, I want to be an adult. I want to be the fullest I can be and be on my soul journey. What role does choice play in that? Because I also hear throughout this book, there's this element of sort of the mystery whispering to you that it's a mystery. It's not something you can just grab hold of or pay
Mm-hmm.
for or sign
Yeah.
up for. But
Yeah.
I feel like there is an element, though, of choice.
Yes. Beautifully said. That's so important of a point. The descent to soul is like the core spiritual adventure that's part of the journey of soul initiation. And we can do things once we're in that stage of life, which we call a cocoon, which corresponds to late adolescence, which most people in the Western world never get to. But once we're in the cocoon, we can make choices of practices that will get the descent going. But once the descent starts happening, the descent to soul, we're kind of like a passenger. We're the raw material that gets shaped, and the ego is no longer in control once some things pick up speed. So let's see, to answer your question a little bit more fully, if we're in early adolescence, which is not a bad thing, a healthy early adolescence is a great stage.
But
And
even if you're in early adolescence
yeah,
as quote unquote an adult, as you're saying, a lot of people
yeah,
are.
yeah,
So, assuming that's a lot of folks.
Exactly. Yeah, really good point. That when I say adolescence, don't think teen years, because early adolescence starts for most people around 12 or 13 or so. But most people stay there for the rest of their lives. But given the nature of your work, Krishna, and your show, there's probably a very large percentage of people listening who are in the cocoon or even beyond. But okay, if you're in early adolescence, then the things you can choose to do are to work on that task of that stage, which has to do with primarily with cultivating personal authenticity. But let me add just a bit more. In one of my earlier books, titled Wild Mind, I present a map of the human psyche that identifies four facets of wholeness that we're each born with. Well, we're born with the seed, with the capacity to develop our human wholeness in these four different ways or facets. And contemporary cultures tend to oppress, not only neglect, but suppress all four of those facets, especially two of them. So many of us, like it was very much true for me when I was younger, that need to do some basic cultivation work of these four facets of wholeness. And when we do that, we're able to address more successfully the tasks of early adolescence. And once we've done that enough, don't have to totally complete it. But once we've done that enough, then mystery, if you will, or soul, will toss us out of early adolescence into the late adolescence of the cocoon, which is a very, very different stage, because early adolescence is all about our social life and developing our personal style and our personal sexuality and so on. But the cocoon is a stage where we more or less withdraw from everyday social life as much as possible, and we start exploring the mysteries of our own human psyche, of the greater psyche of the world, and the mysteries of the larger Earth community, because that's where we're going to have that vision of our soul. Did I say it yet on this program, that this show, that by soul, I mean our unique ecological niche, our place in the larger Earth community? I don't use the word soul the way most people do, but almost everybody uses the word soul to mean one's deepest meaning. And so I'm suggesting that our deepest meaning comes from the place we were born to take in the larger Earth community. It's not a job or a social role. It's an ecological niche. And let's see.
Well, perhaps those aren't mutually exclusive either, or divorced from one another. If you think about it, I mean, really, the job and the role in your vocation is part of the earth. We are the earth, walking and talking. As another way of looking at it. And in essence, it is the soul. The earth is the soul speaking to itself in a way, sort of an overall coherence in a way coming into picture. I mean, one of the things, I always step back to the bigger picture of this, and I was thinking to myself this morning, like, why is there the dance with the soul and the ego? And it seems like that kind of friction is there to enjoy some kind of revelation in a way. It's like why does it feels like we're a seed that's growing, and some grow better than others, and it's sort of like, why is it hard for us why do we have to stumble so terribly and look at what we're going through right now? It's like, I know that's sort of like the biggest question of all time, but when you say soul as this ecocentric viewpoint, I don't see that separate from a cosmological viewpoint of just sort of the greater, how this all fits together, of why it's so easy to go off course in a way. Or is there even such a thing as off course? Perhaps it's all just meandering ways to the same roads leading to Rome.
Yeah, maybe all roads will eventually get to Rome, but we can be lost forever and for the rest of our lives. And why is it so difficult? Well, again, it's because of our contemporary cultures that don't support our natural, innate experience of kinship in the natural world. That's just one of a few examples. And because of that, we get stuck in this egocentric stage. And so the kind of job or career or creative project or a social role that an early adolescent would pick is not soul oriented at all. It's has its roots in contemporary culture, and it
Right.
might. I mean, it's possible. I mean, in a healthy early adolescence, people do contribute to their community in all kinds of ways, but it's chosen by an ego, which is to say, a healthy ego. But the ego doesn't choose its the sole purpose that it's associated with. That mystery
Right.
chooses that. We're born with that. And we have to go through an initiation process to discover what it is. And it's psychospiritually incredibly challenging. So one of the principles of the developmental map that my colleagues and I have created, which we call the Soulcentric developmental wheel, one of the principles is that every stage is the best stage to be in, and every passage from one stage to the next is the worst thing that could happen to you, because you're just about, when you make the passage to the next stage, by definition, you're as good as you're ever going to get at the stage you're leaving, and you're just loving it. So when you get tossed into the cocoon, all of a sudden you get it, that everything about your identity as you've understood it is no longer valid. It's no longer relevant. And what you thought the world was wrong. And that the new identity that you're hoping to discover will not be some new early adolescent version of like a different romance or a different job or a different social role. And so in a healthy culture, the elders and also the adults whose work is initiation, they'll notice that you've entered a really difficult time psychologically and spiritually. And they'll take you aside and they'll say, okay, you're not going crazy. This is what's going on. And we're going to take you into this process or take you away from the village. And you're going to enter this initiation process. Now, in contemporary societies, most people don't leave the village. Like the people we've been working with, the tens of thousands of people over 40 years, most people are in a social or a family situation. They can't just drop out from everything for 3 or 4 or 5 years. Some people can, and their journeys go deeper and faster. But those who can't, there are ways to be in the village but not of it. So hope that helps somewhat.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it seems like there's an initiatory element to this that's central to it that I hear you talking about. And I wonder if you look at sort of as above, so below, what's happening in the whole world right now, it seems like it's a kind of initiation or descent, or do you see it that way?
Yeah, Christian, that is such an interesting topic and one of my favorites. We can go into great depth. We won't have enough time to go very deep, but it's a big question. You're asking, is there some like analogy between an individual initiation process and what our whole species is going through right now, and therefore the whole planet? Yes, I think there's some analogies. They only go so far because evolution is not the kind of process as the development of an individual. For example,
Mm.
individuals die. And so we kind of go through a circle. We're born and then we go through this circle of life and then we die. But species don't. Species can go extinct, but species are evolving constantly and they don't go through the same kind of stages as an individual does. But we can still use the analogy. And if we do use the analogy, I end up with something like this, that we've been in an initiation process for at least 5,000 years. This is like just this 2020 was just kind of a certain kind of apex or a nadir of this journey, that we're in a really incredible crux moment right now. By right now, I mean like 100 years we're in the midst of, and but we're you could say that as a species we're learning how to be human, because we have this mode of consciousness that, as far as we know, no other species has, or if there are any, there's not many, and they're doing a better job than we are. But we can assume that Only we have this mode of consciousness where we have this thing we call the ego, which makes us human, which extracts part of our consciousness from our larger psyche, and we're learning how to operate with this capacity for conscious self-awareness, which is what the ego is. And there's a liability that as a species, we're prone to, which is a kind of pathological greed and a capacity for a kind of violence that we don't see anywhere else on this planet. And it's something that happens to young people if they don't go through initiation. And if someone who's not initiated and has a lot of greed and is willing to use violence to hoard things and other humans, then you end up with a culture that before too long loses all of its initiation knowledge and processes and its elders and its adults, most of its adults. So what we've been doing for 40 years at Animas Valley Institute is trying to remember what the initiation process is like, but to create a contemporary Western version of it, not to borrow or appropriate or co-opt or steal any initiation processes from any of the very few indigenous, intact, healthy cultures that are left, but creating our own form of that. And if we don't make some progress soon, not just with the initiation process, but more generally with growing up as individuals and as collectives, then we might ourselves go extinct. So one last quick comment that in a true soul initiation process, which again takes a few years or more, there's always a danger that the individual won't survive. It's such a challenge to the individual physically and psychologically and spiritually that some people don't survive it. I should say at Animas Valley Institute, we haven't lost anybody yet. But if you look at indigenous initiation rites, they're riskier than ours, and which another way to say that ours usually take longer and maybe don't go as deep. So there's always the chance of death in the soul initiation process. And by analogy, any species going through the kind of initiation process we're talking about might survive it and might not. And a species like ours might even destroy most of life on our planet, which, of course, everybody knows who's listening. That's what we're doing right now. Will our planet make it through this initiation rite? I hope so. There's a lot of us doing all we can to get there, but we don't know the outcome.
Do you call the sacred wound, is that another way of describing the ego in a sense, or this gift we've been given? I'm calling it a gift. This ability to have self-awareness, it's sort of a unique factor of who we are, so we think, but also our biggest weapon. How do we wield this thing? But do you see it also as a gift? It seems to be the central element of the entire journey.
Absolutely. Totally agree. And I think that's the pattern. That's the way it works. Even individually, but to stay on the species level, our mode of consciousness that involves the ego is our greatest gift. And it allows us to gift the world, to enhance the life of the world, and even to cooperate with evolution consciously, that as far as we know, no other species is capable of. So our greatest treasure, our greatest power is also our greatest vulnerability. That's true for us individually. When we go through the soul initiation process, we access a power that if we're not mature enough to use it, we could destroy ourselves or others with it.
I feel that there is a trap in contemporary meditation practices of this idea of controlling or ameliorating the ego. And it feels like a fool's errand to me. And it feels like I tend to align more with sort of thoughts like Ram Dass's of witnessing the show going by. So it's sort of a loving the process as opposed to controlling the process. And it feels like, I'd like to know what you think about when you're in this process of the descent and the canyon and this journey and this initiation, how much of that is allowing and watching things happening, including your own machinations in your mind and trying to stop or control or judge, that's, I would assume, always going to be there, as opposed to transcending it or getting rid of it or not having that. What does that process feel like for people when they're in it, so they know that maybe they think they're doing it right or wrong?
Yeah, good question. It may help to introduce one of the maps we use. It's pretty simple. And you find this kind of distinction in all over the world, that there's these three worlds: upper world, middle world, and underworld. And they're not literally different places, of course. They're really three different realms of consciousness. Or for an individual human, there are three different realms of identity. So in the upper world, we all have the same identity. We're all this vast imagination. Some people might call it God or the divine, and our individual consciousness is a sliver of that. So that's the experience of transcendence. In the middle world, which is the everyday village world of life, taking care of business and raising families and so on, social roles and jobs, we have an identity that might correspond to our role in our family and our job and so forth. But in the underworld, we have this soul-oriented identity, which as I mentioned, is essentially, it tells us what our unique ecological niche is. But the way we humans understand that consciously is through metaphor. So at Animas, we call it our mythopoetic identity. It's a metaphor, like of a dream symbol or an archetype or a myth, that clues us in consciously about what our deeper identity is. So without telling a story real briefly, mine has to do with weaving cocoons. That's what I was shown on my first soul encounter, that my work in this life would be weaving cocoons. And the way I do it is through, a professional job, you might say, as a soul initiation guide or as a psychologist or an author. But what I'm really doing, and what I'm consciously that I'm doing, is I'm weaving cocoons. Like, people might say, right now I'm having a conversation on a podcast with Krishna, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm doing my best to weave cocoons here. Okay, so you asked about like how to be with the descent and this experience, because it starts with the experience of dismemberment, we call it dissolution. It's like a caterpillar body dissolving in a cocoon, and things are falling apart. And but being in the cocoon is a relatively mature state compared to most Western humans. And we've developed all kinds of capacities through cultivating our four facets of wholeness. And so one of the things we practice during the descent, including, not especially the dissolution or dismemberment phase, is that we're letting mystery have its way with us. We know that by the time that's happening for us, we know that we're not going to figure out with our strategic minds what our true place in the world is, that our strategic cognitive minds aren't capable of that. They're good for something else, but not that. So we've learned that we've got to go along for the ride, and it's going to be a rough one. And that's one of the reasons why a guide is so important, that because a guide can say to you at a certain point, you need to go along with this experience you're having in your deep imagination, your dreams, or this encounter you're having in this cave out in a remote wild place, is something you just got to go with, and you're ready for it. Or the guide might say, you know what, given what I hear is happening for you, you're not quite prepared for this yet. We're going to press the pause button and work on cultivating your wholeness some more before you're ready for this. But of course, all of this contrasts with what's often called spiritual bypass, that the transcendent, if you're in early adolescence, the transcendent experience, the experience of merging with the divine in consciousness in some way, is an early adolescent version of transcendence. And unfortunately, a lot of people in early adolescence use the transcendent experience to avoid their own healing and their own wounds, and dealing with relationship problems and trauma and so on. So the upper world experience can be an escape, especially if it's happening for a person in early adolescence. Let me know if I'm addressing your question.
I hear you saying psychedelics and the psychedelic renaissance, and I want to talk about that. So
Good.
how psychedelics can be part of the practice and how they could potentially be a distraction. I think you're speaking to it already,
Yeah.
because spiritual bypass as a concept is important to bring up. I think a lot of people's hearts are in the right place, that they really want to grow and they want to find that authenticity that you're speaking about like, who am I and how do I express that in the world? And it's easy to get lost or off course or not have elders who you think maybe are elders, or getting misinformation, especially when we're awash in it. So let's focus in a little bit on psychedelics before we talk about the wellness movement as a whole, because that is something I'd like to talk about.
Good.
So, how do you feel that it's part of this practice potentially, and how can it be used effectively versus it being maybe a distraction or a false star that you're following?
Yeah, and you're referring to psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not a specialist in psychedelics, but I have some things to say about it. I did have many entheogenic journeys when I was in my 20s, and not too much since then. But I know lots of psychonauts, very serious explorers of consciousness through entheogens, and read a lot of books and so forth. And one of the things, if I try to summarize the things I've read and the many conversations I've had in my own experience, I'd say that, again, most psychedelics, not maybe most, but a large percentage of people using psychedelics are in early adolescence. And as we are learning, psychedelics can be incredibly valuable for healing, including healing from trauma. And it's being more and more used in psychotherapy, and also with people with terminal cancer and so on in hospice situations. And so I don't want to in any way minimize. I mean, because that's extremely valuable use of psychedelics that we're just benefiting from in such large ways, and can so much more as we continue learning. But maybe your question is really for people in the cocoon, which is, again, maybe 20% of the Western world, maybe somewhat more on people listening here. The question is, well, how can psychedelics be part of the journey of soul initiation? I believe that in a large percentage of healthy, intact cultures of the past and present, that sacred medicines have been used in one of their ways to support the journey of soul initiation, because there is this experience of ego dissolution. So if a person's in the cocoon and has had an adequate dose of an entheogen, and ideally is being supported in a ceremony or a practice by a guide who understands what soul initiation is about, not many of us around, but under those circumstances, and I believe, again, in healthy, intact cultures, this would be the case, the entheogen or psychedelic can support both dissolution and the experience of soul encounter. So I had an experience early in the cocoon, which I've never talked about as a soul encounter, but I do write about it, including in this new book. And it was when I was in my early 20s, I was in college, and my roommates and I swallowed some healthy doses of mescaline, which of course is the psychoactive component in the peyote cactus. And I had this vision that was absolutely terrifying of this huge rock being that held my consciousness in its grasp for hours and hours and hours and hours. And I thought it was going to kill me and didn't know what to do. And I ended up rummaging through. Unfortunately, we were just in our apartment, and I rummaged through and found some colored modeling clay of different colors. And so I I made a sculpture of this terrifying being. And I said to it, "This is my way of letting you know I hear you and I'm there with you." And I had no idea what it meant. Um, and it took 10 years before I found out. And it was several months after my first soul encounter where I learned about weaving cocoons. But I was out in the desert with a friend, looking for a place that I might bring people on soul initiation processes. And in this canyon, I saw this being that I had been accosted by 10 years earlier. And that led to it. It was like a major breadcrumb, Krishna, is what I'm saying, that we get these breadcrumb experiences when we're early in the cocoon, that little symbols are big symbols and something to follow, that if we follow them, as I did, and this, when I found that rock being, which I call the guardian in this canyon in southern Utah, it led to a whole series of other experiences that ended up with additional soul encounters and so on. And that's why I like to say that, true adulthood is actually an incredibly exciting, enchanted, mysterious, fulfilling, joyous stage of life to be in, because there's this whole like mystical journey that leads to not only our greatest fulfillment, but our deepest service to the world. Okay, that's at least the start on psychedelics.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. So our listeners should know we both have a connection. I've talked about Southern Utah and my spot down there a lot on the show, and we have this crossing of paths almost literally down there, which is amazing, which I just found out a few months back. And what is it about that landscape for you? Because I'm sure it's something similar for me. It just feels like I've described it as a raw nature diet in a sense. Like it's been unsullied as much as other places. And it's particularly in the United States, it just feels charged. And every time I go out in those canyons or those deserts, those mesas, I feel so humbled. And it just, even if every winter I go away, maybe it starts to drift and I start thinking like, well, this or that. And then I get back and it's instant. It's like, oh, right. And there's something about that medicine for me, that humbling of feeling my place inside a system that I'm not totally in control of. I'm certainly not even at the top of it by any means. I have to pay attention. There's a beauty to it and there's an energy to it that I find really an important part of this journey and this mystery of walking on this planet. And I'm assuming you feel something similar, but particularly about that area.
Yes. Most everybody who's been into the canyon country, red rock, slick rock canyon country, have been swept off their feet by the magic, enchantment of that place. And we can speculate about why. And I'll tell you that I don't know, but I'll speculate. It may be that a lot of what we might call the enchanted spirits of the world have fled from other places because of the way we've been in the Western world, and they found refuge there. I don't know. It may be that it's always been that kind of charged place. Like my partner Janine Marie Haugen and I, the way she puts it is that there's lots of chi there. There's a lot of aliveness there. There's a lot of wildness there, and maybe that's primarily it. It's a kind of wildness that has been chased away from most of the places in the world now. But it's very much alive there, that wildness. Some would say there are spirits of various sorts there. And then there's this phenomena that there are individuals in the world like me and probably you, Krishna, who there's something about our psyches that particularly resonate with that place that might be more true than for just the average person. So for me, for example, I grew up in New England, outside Boston, and I had a series of repeating dreams as a child, starting at age 4 or so, and through the next 3 or 4 years, of a landscape that had absolutely no correspondence whatsoever to anything in New England, and it's nothing my parents or anybody even knew about a landscape like that. And it was many years, 20 years later, that when I first got to southern Utah, I gasped because I realized that's the landscape I was in as a 4-year-old in these repeating dreams. So I'm sure that's one reason I'm drawn so deeply and I'm so moved and altered by just being in that landscape.
It's such a wild place. Things just happen there just by being there. We've been leading retreats there for the past few years, once a year, and really the main goal of it is like getting people there and then just being there
Yeah.
and opening them up through various exercises and music and this and that. It's like, hey, you're just here to sort of listen, and everyone's going to have their unique experience. But
Yes.
it's an amplifying place for sure.
There's no question about it. I've been leading groups and programs there for over 40 years and all over southern Utah. That's the choice place to go. And we often, if not usually, backpack into remote places and places that are very special and unique that I've been spending years and years and years looking for, because for the kind of ceremonies we do, we want certain kinds of places with certain feelings and energies there. And yeah, so when you add the effect of just that place, which is plenty, to certain kinds of initiatory practices and ceremonies, it's very profound.
Are there ways people can invite this initiatory experience for themselves independently?
Yeah. The first thing, of course, is to get into this stage of life, the cocoon, which means to go through the passage from early to late adolescence. That passage we call confirmation. And if there's a ceremony that supports that passage, that's a rite of passage. But what happens in the cocoon is not a rite of passage, but a set of practices. And so, yeah, there are people I know of who have gone through this process on their own without an utter guide. There's some famous examples, like Carl Jung, the depth psychologist, the originator in many ways of depth psychology. He went through this process on his own. He was a psychiatrist, 1916.
With 5 kids.
With 5 kids and a wife and a practice of seeing his patients at home.
Yeah.
And he started going through the dissolution phase, the second phase of the descent. And he ended up having inner guides through his deep imagination, but he had no outer guides. And there was the question in his mind about whether he was going to survive, and he managed to do it. The Earth Elder, eco-philosopher Joanna Macy, I also tell her story, her initiation story in this book, and she had Buddhist meditation teachers, but she didn't have any soul initiation guides, and she managed to get through it. What's the pattern? It's that people say yes to the call to soul. That when a descent to soul starts, there's one of the patterns is that there's 2 things happening simultaneously. One is that there's a crisis in your everyday life, and another one is there's a call from the depths, what Joseph Campbell called the call to spiritual adventure. And the crisis is essentially an identity crisis, that who you thought you were starts to crumble. You just lose your faith in it. And this might be supported by you, like you're losing your romance or your job or your house in a tornado or something, or maybe you've had some serious illness, but there's some major crisis that happens that weakens your ego identity enough that you're vulnerable to the second thing, which is the call from soul. And the call from soul is it's sort of like falling in love. It's like feeling like you're being drawn into the depths, that there's like you're hearing this enchanting, compelling song somewhere off in the distance, and you feel called to it. It's really an experience of eros, of deep eros, and that you're willing to leave everything in your life in order to follow this call, um, this dream. So when crisis and call, if that's happening in your life, and it sounds like what I'm talking about, and you're pretty sure you're in the cocoon, and your life isn't primarily about your social life, which is early adolescence, then yeah, what can you do? You say yes to the crisis and the call. And then, of course, you get a copy of my book to help you out. And if you can find a soul initiation guide or an elder, you ask for help. And if you can't find one, you just, you would want to withdraw as much as possible from everyday social life in order to let the mystery have its way with you. And that advice, namely, withdrawing as much as you can from everyday social life, is the worst thing you could possibly do if you're in early adolescence, because social belonging is everything. When people become socially isolated in early adolescence, they get depressed, they become suicidal. It's not a thing to do. So I want everybody who's listening to me, if you're not sure you're in the cocoon, do not socially isolate. It'll help you in the cocoon. It will destroy you in early adolescence, which we call the oasis.
Yeah, and all this is laid out in your book in a lot more detail.
Yeah.
There's quite an intoxication, though, these days with people becoming physically addicted through the chemicals in their brain, through social media and so forth, of this social interaction, with a vapidity to it that's just like goes beyond, I think, what we were ever set up for in our
Yes.
neurochemistry. And so, when you say it's dangerous, I think perhaps we don't even realize like how plugged in we are to the matrix, and how just like pulling all those tubes out could be too fast too soon. And I think we have to build a new map in a way for how do we creatively and gently and sustainably disengage so that you can enter into the cocoon and go through this process. It's not like you can jump in maybe head first depending on where you're at and safely do that. Right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of the modern wellness movement, and this is what I wanted to ask you about. On one level, the fact that it's so big and popular and growing shows you that people are hungry for that authenticity, and that there's something happening. And I think in that, so that we see that. But on the other level, inevitably, a lot of that movement is misguided or grasping at something it doesn't even quite realize what it's really grasping for. And it's sort of maybe at the surface, or there's spiritual bypass, or all sorts of things going on, but not all of it. Because, I mean, your book is part of that, and my podcast is part of that. And like it's part of this overall energy of people saying, as Charles Eisenstein says, like, a more beautiful world, your heart tells you that's possible. Something in you knows I can do better, we can do better. There's something there, and they're trying to get there. So what are some of these blind spots that the wellness movement perhaps has, and how can we spot them to find that authenticity and truth?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. Haven't heard that one before, so I'm going to be winging it a bit. It's probably a pretty safe hypothesis to say that most of the leaders of the wellness movement are healthy early adolescents in terms of their psychological stage. I don't mean that as a put down or a criticism. It's implicitly a criticism of our culture, but not of these individuals. And so, like, the question is, well, what's it going to get us? Why pursue wellness? Well, an early adolescent is going to say, it's going to improve my social relationships. It's going to improve my romantic relationship. It's going to enhance my capacity to serve my community through my work. And maybe I can progress in my career more effectively when I'm less anxious and less depressed, and I have these tools, meditation and so forth, good nutrition and on, exercise, and so that, I can heal myself more effectively, and I can be healed more effectively by healers. And the question is, what's the ultimate goal? And the ultimate goal for a person in early adolescence are the things I'm talking about. So what's the blind side there is that that human life is a much, much bigger story. And there's actually 5 stages of human life after early adolescence. And each one has its own mysteries and challenges. And so there's a start. What do you see, Krishna? What are the blind sides?
Well, I guess I like when you say like a lot of being an early adolescence. In a sense, there's an element of being a seeker. So like there's this beautiful innocence of saying of wanting, and
Mm-hmm.
without any judgment to that. And it's like, okay, that's a necessary sort of fuel for the fire, and perhaps a lot of it out there is others who have discovered ways to seek and to want. And but I guess what I see a lot of is practices that tend to amplify the ego,
Oh,
or you get into like self-aggrandized sense of self or importance, or even like the person who's quote unquote leading whatever that method is or thing. It becomes more about them than the practice or the result. It
yeah.
seems like it's all wrapped up in the problem itself. It's like, frankly, like when I started doing music with East Forest, it initially started through some very powerful experience of myself where I had no interest in making a business out of it. I just had this experience and I started giving away what gave me the experience, which was a
Mm-hmm.
particular piece of music for years. And eventually I felt a calling inside after like 5 or 6 years to how would I'm supposed to take this more into the public light, but that means I have to be, there's no way not to be inside the system of capitalism to do that game. It's a game.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a dance. And that dance to this day is one that it is fun at times but you're constantly checking in like, how do I use the tools that in some ways are the problem and still speak, as you say, with the authenticity that is hopefully helping the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the dance I see in the wellness movement, and to some areas way more success than others. And maybe it has something to do with, I've always agreed that the end result is that it's helping you realize your innate gifts and how you share them in the world. And I have some kind of trust that's there's some kind of rightness to that. I don't have to understand how those gifts fit in or what those gifts. That's not for me to know. But there's something there, and that kind of, and it should feel it feels good when you finally get to a place where it's like, this is me, and sharing that is like a puzzle piece into the world that's helping the world. How you get there, maybe there are many different ways to do that, and there is no one path.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like a lot of what's going on is sort of about instant gratification or getting there quickly, or you're telling you you're somewhere further along than perhaps you're not. And it's not really in the name of service, or it's service because it's out of shame and guilt, as opposed to like, it's just naturally now it all fits. How could it not be, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of different ideas there, but at the end of the day, I see the industry exploding, and in one ways, I see that as a symptom of the chaos and the apocalypse and the breakdown,
Mm-hmm.
which is they kind of go in opposite energies. So in some ways, that's a good thing, but it's just sort of chaotic because everything's moving so quickly.
Yeah. What can I say here? Like one of the slices, one of the dimensions of what we might call the wellness movement now is being called the purpose movement. And so there's more and more coaches and guides showing up saying, I'm a guide to your purpose. And virtually all of them, as far as I can tell, are talking about early adolescent purpose, which is an important thing. Like, what is my gift? What is my particular talent? And it's defined in terms of a creative project or a social role or a job. And discovering that kind of purpose is an important thing or a valuable thing. in early adolescence because it's helping us understand our authenticity on the personality or the ego level. And this is something we have to do in order to progress from the early adolescent oasis eventually to the late adolescent cocoon. So that notion of gifts, that early adolescent notion of gifts and purpose and meaning, it's an important part of the journey in that stage. But what our work is about at Animas Valley Institute and what I'm writing about in this new book, The Journey of Soul Initiation, is on a much, much deeper level. It's a very different kind of journey. We're not discovering our gifts in the sense, or a purpose in the sense of a job or a role, social role, but rather, again, in terms of the greater Earth community, that this mystical place or ecological niche that I was born to take. So for me, for example, I've just given a very brief glimpse of it in this during this hour of cocoon weaving. I was shown on my first soul encounter that my task was to weave cocoons. And soul, you could say soul told me that, or the muse told me that, but the soul didn't say, oh, by the way, you're going to be a vision fast guide, Bill, or you're going to write books, which I wouldn't have believed for a second back then, or you're going to do this through being a psychologist, or you're going to become a soul initiation guide. These are all particular cultural ways for me, given my strengths and weaknesses, to embody cocoon weaving. So understanding one's purpose on that level, it's a whole different thing than what most people now talk about purpose or gifts and so on. And in early adolescence, we don't know if there's a relationship between what we think of as our gifts and purpose, if there's a relationship between those things and what we were born to do or be in this lifetime. We don't know it yet. There might be a relationship, like we might discover some gifts or talents in early adolescence that turn out to be essential powers that we need to deliver our soul gift to the world. But we won't know that until we go through the initiation journey.
I mean, are there ways that we can help others to essentially midwife their own other people's processes, sort of the way we integrate with the world and our communities and friends?
I'm sorry, did you say are there ways we can help others?
Just the ways that we can, not just how we can help ourselves on this journey, but how can we help others on the journey so we can all sort of go through this process?
Yeah. Well, again, the first thing is to make sure you're in the cocoon. And there's all kinds of things we can do to help each other that could be called wellness processes. I call them holing and self-healing processes, that we can help each other with those in order to address the tasks of the oasis of early adolescence. And then it's not up to us, as I've been saying, it's up to mystery to move our center of gravity to the cocoon. If we're in the cocoon, and especially if we don't have soul initiation guides, but even if we do, one of the most valuable things is to spend time to be with other people who are in the cocoon, because they understand what's going on, and you can support each other in the cocoon, because you'll know that what you're going through is nothing like you ever went through in early adolescence. And so, like in the groups we lead, we support the participants to support each other as they go through the process. And soul initiation is not something that happens in a 5-day or a 10-day or a 14-day long program, even an Animas program. It's something that takes years. And that having kind of a cocoon sangha, I never called it that before, but it can be of tremendous support. Absolutely.
Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh, I think he said the next Buddha would be the Sangha.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's
Yeah.
things just do feel very pointed, as you say right now. And I think everyone can feel that and know that. Then you can look at history and say, like, it does feel like things are compressed in a way and connected globally in a way that's different. And why all that is or what all that means or how that fits into the greater picture, it does feel that there is a real invitation right now that is urgent.
Yes.
But at the same time, we can't speed up or rush this process you're speaking of. It takes time. It's a time-rich process. And
Yes.
for better or worse, I guess that's where we're at. But there are a lot of tools out there, and your book is one of them. And I'm hopeful that we can continue to thread this needle. I just trust that the process is unfolding as it needs to. And certainly many things need to slough off. We need to burn the fields in a way. There's things we do need to get rid of. And so we are seeing that happening in a lot of ways. We're seeing a lot of things falling apart.
Yes.
That is a kind of descent that we're in overall. And so I would imagine it is mirrored in the individual. And I felt that through this pandemic particularly, which is a particular nodal point of this, there are these doorways in each of us that are opening that we can choose to walk through or not. But there's these opportunities through the changes of habits and routines and breakdown that is unique to each of us. And I'm hopeful that, and I've seen from my own conversations with people that a lot of people are seeing this and making changes on their own volition because they want to and because they've gotten off a certain kind of treadmill. And so I'm hoping that'll push things forward in a healthy way.
Yeah, I agree. Things are speeding up. And one of the patterns of evolution that we know about is that when there's about to be a major leap forward in evolution of life on this planet, it starts with a time of tremendous breakdown. That breakdown always happens first. So, and there's lots of good examples. I won't take the time now to give any, but if you look at evolution, that's the pattern. And so one could say, well, wow, we're seeing that right now, that we're in this immense crisis where we have one particular species, humans, who are poisoning the world in such a way that it's causing this sixth mass extinction. And this is a major crisis for the planet. And if there was ever going to be some grand leap forward for our species, this would be the time. That it's more likely to happen now precisely because of the immense multiple crises that we've created for ourselves and the rest of the planet. So
That's right.
This could be the time.
We have set the stage. Well, thanks. Thank you so much, Bill. The Journey of Soul Initiation, a field guide for visionaries, evolutionaries, and revolutionaries. I believe it's out, right? I heard it's in the...
It's out. It's officially out about 2 weeks ago. You can find it anywhere books are sold, and you can learn more about our work at www.animas.org. Animas is the Spanish word for souls. It's ANIMAS, animas.org.
Yeah, that'll be in the show notes too. And well, thank you. I really appreciated talking with you, and it's been fun reading your book too. And I hope to cross paths in the real world in Southern Utah.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure having this conversation with you, Krishna. And I'll be in Utah much of this year, and I'll hope to see you there.
Yeah, just wave. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for that valuable conversation, and I look forward to crossing paths with you again, both in the digital space, but hopefully in our hometown there in Southern Utah, as I know we're like practically neighbors when you come through town, so that's a beautiful synchronicity in itself. But I can't recommend his book highly enough, all of his books, if you're really looking to dive deeper and look for a meaningful map of walking through these times from someone who has got a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience. So check it out. Check it out as soon as you can. This song that you're hearing in the background is called Deep Pond, and it's from my very first East Forest album, The Education of the Individual Soul, which, for the record, is offered as a gift in the download downloadable form. If you go to eastforest.org, hit the music tab, that record has always been free as a gift to experience, because it's really what started everything for me, which was such a gift. And I wanted to make that be the bedrock of everything that sprang forth in this ecosystem. And it's always been that way. So hence the eastforest.org. Excuse me. So you can check that out. And there's a sample in there. There's little girls who were in a labyrinth on Block Island on the East Coast. And I was also in the labyrinth, and I was just sort of holding my recorder and his two sisters. And one of the sisters would always repeat what the older sister said. So one sister's like 6 or something, and the other one's like 3. It was so beautiful and so cute and so cosmic. But before we go, thanks again for checking out everything we have going on with some new tour dates, eastforest.org/tour. Also at that same website, eastforest.org, scroll down on the homepage and you'll see all the information about the Patreon, the East Forest Council that we're doing exclusively on Patreon. See if it's something you want to join, and join this whole movement and this community and become a soldier of love. You can also check it out, patreon.com/eastforest. That's my blither blather. I will catch you next week, God willing. Until then, I hope you get some sunshine on your face, and I hope you keep walking your walk. Don't take any shit, but if you do, you know what to do. Do it with grace.